In this lesson, we're going to talk a little bit about I, which is an imaginary number. So the definition of I is the square root of a negative 1. Square root of a negative 1. So I squared is negative 1, because if I squared each side, obviously that would give me I squared on the left and negative 1 on the right. So when I simplify expressions with I, that just means whenever I get the square root of a negative 1, I'm going to take it to the outside and turn it into an I. So simplifying the square root of 50, this one doesn't have a negative, so I'm just breaking this down into radical 25, radical 2. Why did I choose 25 instead of 5 and 10? Because 25 is a perfect square. The square root of 25 is 5, the square root of 2 is ugly, so that has to stay inside. So 5 radical 2. For radical 40, negative radical 40, I've got negative 1, so I'm keeping the negative separate. We know this one is going to turn into I. 40, I would break down. I could do 4 times 10. I could do 8 times 5. Which one makes more sense? 4 times 10, because 4 is a perfect square. So the square root of 4 is 2. The square root of this negative 1 is I. So on the outside, I have 2i, and on the inside, I still have that radical 10. So it's all a matter of breaking it down. I always bring that to the outside so I don't forget my I. In general, if you're taking the square root of a negative, you're going to end up with an I on the outside. For this one, obviously, again, this is an easy one. Hopefully, you just get 8, because the square root of 64 is 8. No negatives on that one. If it were the square root of a negative 64, you would just tell me that it's 8i. 8i. For this one, please don't be the person who tries to ching those two and turn it into the square root of positive 32. This is a whole separate term. I can't do anything with it until I take it outside of the radical. So if I'm reducing this, again, I'm looking for things that go into it that are perfect squares. I'm going to choose 16 and 2, but also a negative 1. And notice I have a negative on the outside, but that negative on the outside is going to stay on the outside. So I have negative, the square root of negative 1 is I, the square root of 16 is 4, so on the outside I have 4i, and on the inside I still have that radical 2. So that is how I would write that. Negative from this negative, and then 4i, because I took out essentially a negative 16, and then I left the 2 on the inside. For negative radical 90, would I have an I on this question? I would not, because the negative is on the outside, so I don't need to worry about the I. I would just break this down into radical 9, radical 10. The square root of radical 9 is 3, so that gives me the negative from the outside, and the 3, which is now on the outside, radical 10, still on the inside. And then the square root of negative 16, so think about the square root of positive 16 would just be 4. So the square root of negative 16 would be 4i. So that negative, just because we are taking the square root of a negative. So try these 3 on your own and then press play to check your work. Square root of negative 36, before we would just say this can't be simplified. Now we're going to simplify with an I. So the square root of 36 is 6. The negative here makes it 6i instead. The square root of negative 14. 14, I try to break it down. I think 1 and 14, that doesn't really help me. 2 and 7, no perfect square factors in that. But what I can do is still take out this negative. So even though I can't do anything with the 14, I can break it down into negative 1 and radical 14. And this negative 1 turns into an I. And so on the outside, I have a negative and I have an I. And on the inside, I still have 14 because I can't break it down any more than that. And then this last one, 75, I would break that down into square root of negative 1, square root of 25, square root of 3. I know the square root of negative 1 is I. The square root of 25 is 5. The square root of 3 is ugly, so it has to stay inside. So I would call that 5i radical 3. This is the correct order in which you would write your answer. The constant or coefficient, the I, and then whatever the radical is. Here are a few more simplifying examples for us to do. Again, when I have something like this, I could either reduce the top and bottom and then simplify, or I could simplify first and then reduce. So I'm going to show you each way. Simplify each. So the first one, I would call that radical -1 and radical 9 and radical 10, which would give me 3i radical 10. And then I would reduce this one, and I would only be able to take that I out. So it would be I radical 10. And when I reduced those, the I would cancel and the radical 10 would cancel, and I would be left with just 3. The other option is to reduce first, then simplify. So write this as -90 over -10. -90 over -10 reduces to 9, and the square root of 9 is 3. So completely up to you, whichever way you like better. Try these two questions on your own and then press play to check your work. So I'm going to simplify these expressions. The first, I would simplify -64 into 8i, so minus 8i as my numerator. I would simplify the square root of -4 into 2i. My i's would cancel. -8 divided by 2 would be -4. That would be my final answer. When I'm multiplying, I would take the negative out, so this would be I radical 3 times I radical 3. I times I is I squared. Radical 3 times radical 3 is 3. We know that the definition of I is the square root of -1, which means I squared is -1. So I squared would give me -1 times 3, which is -3. This is the correct answer. If you would have tried to multiply it first, you would have had -3 times -3, which was +9, and ended up with a +3, and that is not the correct answer. So you can't just disregard my negatives that are inside the radical. So be very careful with that.